This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio. I'm your host, Brijesh Ammanath. Today our guest is Andreas Møller. Andreas is a co-founder of Toddle, a no-code tool for building scalable, performant web applications. He's an experienced vice president of engineering with a demonstrated history of working in the information technology and services industry. Andreas, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So today we are going to talk about no-code platforms. Let's jump and get started with the basics. Andreas, can you help our listeners by defining what is no-code?
Yes, so that's a really good question because I think there are quite a lot of different definitions floating around. But the general definition we go by, and I think is largely also the most broad one, is it's any kind of technology where traditionally that's been solved by writing code, but there are now a different approach. I mean, like a visual way of doing it. And so maybe the most famous example of this, and I think also the tool that coined the term, is Webflow, which is an application for building websites. And there's quite a lot of it. It's been a very popular space for a couple of years now. For the last at least 5 years, we've seen a lot of new tools come out. So it's very much a growing space, and we're seeing more and more of these platforms pop up. And even last year, we saw several quite prominent platform launch.
Right. And I also know that the term low code is used quite frequently. Are no code and low code the same?
I think that there's sort of a minor difference in the terms. They are very often used interchangeably. So there is not a clear distinction that you can always rely on. But I think the term low code is largely the idea that entirely removing code from a normal workflow is either not possible or not easily achieved. And as a result, you sort of end up with a little bit of a mix and match solution where you'll add some code here and there, but a lot of the things you're building, you're still building without code. So I think the main difference is that with low code, you are still coding as part of your daily workflow. And in a no-code workflow, you might occasionally have to add a little bit of code, but it's mostly done without writing any code.
So it's just drag and drop, and that reduces the flexibility?
Well, so in a lot of times, in a lot of cases, it can reduce flexibility. I mean, you can overall say it does. But the way we generally see it, at least in Toddle, is that we are limiting the number of ways you can do something, but we're not really limiting what you can do. And so the limitations of each tool is very dependent on the tool. Some tools are very optimized for speed and ease of use. And in return, they also limit a lot what you can actually do with them. Others are a lot more broad and impose very little limitation on what you can build.
While researching for this session, I came across an interesting stats. I'm just going to read it out. According to Research and Markets, the low-code and no-code development platform market is expected to generate about $187 billion by 2030. And it was about $30 billion in 2023. Gartner also estimates that 70% of new applications are going to be developed in enterprises by using no-code or low-code technologies by 2025, up from less than 25% in 2020. And those numbers are just mind-bogglingly huge. What is fueling this growth or adoption of no-code?
So I think the first thing to note with that is that that's not that recent of a study anymore. And I would actually suspect they might be even more bullish if they had to do the same today. Because we have seen a lot of adoption, and we've also seen a lot of growth in the number of tools out there. I think there's a few things fueling this. And to sort of understand a little bit about that, you also have to understand that when we say no-code tools or the no-code market, which like Gartner likes to say, there isn't really a no-code market. There's quite a lot of markets that has no-code tools. In the definition I sort of presented earlier, saying it's largely just a term that means an area where everything used to rely on code, where we now have a set of more visual tools, right? But that really doesn't define a market very much. So it really does depend on the specific tool you're talking about. But the majority of the no-code sort of change has happened in the area of where it enables non-developers, people who wasn't traditionally developers, to build applications. And we especially seeing a large growth for internal software. So tools like Retool, JetAdmin has had immense success with enabling companies to build smaller internal tools very easily and usually without actually involving large part of the respective engineering organizations. So a lot of times it's a way to sort of be able to actually produce software, but without spending valuable time from your often more highly paid employees in your engineering department.
That's interesting and leads us nicely into the next topic of discussion, which I wanted to touch on, which is what's the role of developer in the no-code marketplace or environment? So according to you, what's the primary role of a developer in a no-code environment?
So I think for a lot of cases, for a lot of tools are really designed for people who can't traditionally code. So they're really designed with the first and foremost principle of how simple can we make this, to a point where even if you've never programmed before, you can fairly quickly pick that up. But at the other end of that spectrum of no code, which is where Toddle, the company I founded, lies, we're a lot more focused on how can we improve the efficiency of technology teams. So I think there's one end where you basically say we don't really need programmers because we simplified things so much that knowledge isn't that important anymore. And at the other end, we have still professional software teams. And in our end, in Toddle and what we're building, developers are very much a big part of that. While we're removing a lot of the early frictions of learning to code, I think all your listeners will know that's not all software engineers do. There's actually quite a lot to the job, and you don't even code all of the day, right? So there's still every bit as much need for engineering. We're still building distributed systems at the end of the day, and they have race conditions and problems and everything we always run into. You still need to do data modeling and architecture and all these things. None of that went away. The only thing that we've slightly changed is the fact that you don't need to spend often several years learning a programming language before you can get started.
Can you expand on that? And are there any examples of tasks or responsibilities that developers typically handle in a no-code project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can sort of mostly speak about how we do it at Toddle. So we both build a no-code tool, the platform, but we are also working in it. So since Toddle is itself built in Toddle, we built a no-code tool in itself. So that means we are also a full company working every day in this no-code tool, building it. And we're a cross-functional team that consists of engineers, designer, as well as a marketer. We're a fairly small team still. And the whole team, including our marketer, actually works in Toddle. Not always daily. Obviously, our marketer does a lot of other things, but he's also able to go in and make changes. And so what really changes in our setup is that rather than having a more traditional sort of almost assembly line of features where, a product manager will come along and say, let's build this thing. A designer will then design it, and an engineer implements it. We're actually able to work in parallel. So engineers can work on the logic of one feature while the designer works on the UI. And they're not handing off the design to be implemented. They're literally implementing the final UI. So by having that sort of dynamic, the role of the developer didn't change, but a lot of the sort of more maybe cumbersome task of just producing UI that someone already designed, that actually goes away, and you can start focus on the functionality and the interaction, which is, I think, what most engineers find to be more interesting, especially when building the front-end part of applications.
We will deep dive into the Toddle development model in terms of that platform itself in the next section. But before we go there, I had a few more questions on the role of developers. The next one would be, do you have any examples or success stories where developers have played a crucial role in driving innovation through no-code development?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think our own case is a very good example of building something immensely complex in a no-code setup, right? Mm-hmm. We've also had a lot of examples among our customers. We had a person who signed up to Toddle and actually managed to start a company in 10 days. Like from he started building an app till he had his first customer onboarded, it took 10 days, right? And he was a developer, but he was not a particularly experienced developer. He's done some coding before, but didn't have a long career behind him, right? And we're also seeing examples of people switching from, we have a few users that have longer careers in coding that switch to no code for the simple reason of you can just deliver faster, right? You can produce applications faster. than you can do in a traditional setup, right? And that iteration time, that sort of ability to move fast ends up being incredibly valuable.
Agreed. When I started coding, we had something called as RAD, Rapid Application Development. And
Yeah.
low code reminds me a lot about that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities. I think forever we've been chasing this idea of a lower feedback time, right? Most of my career has been as a web developer, and we sort of went from in the old days where you wrote some code and then uploaded it somewhere and then had to refresh your browser to see if it worked. And then we started getting build system, and eventually we got some auto reload where the browser would automatically refresh. And it was the greatest innovation in the world, because now it only took like 2 seconds from you made a change to you could, or maybe 5 seconds, because our page didn't load so fast at the time. And so we've seen these improvements all the time. And the fact that feedback time has always been a key metric to chase, because we know the lower the feedback time, essentially the faster you can experiment and the faster you can iterate, right? And what we're seeing with no code, especially for front end and for building UI, is that we're now getting that feedback down to milliseconds. So you're really like clicking on something, you're selecting, you're changing properties, and you're seeing the changes right there. You don't even have to look away from what you're working on while you're editing, right? So by getting that cycle time down, productivity just goes way up. And that keeps happening all the way down to like when you're getting down to a couple of milliseconds feedback.
I also believe there's a change in perspective that needs to happen when you start building out in no-code platforms. So have you seen developers facing challenges when they start out in this new model of development?
Yeah, I think one of the things, way to look at a no-code platform is you can kind of see it as a framework that's very opinionated, right? Because generally no-code platforms are. So where, for example, if people work with web development, where something like React is generally considered very not opinionated, you can bring in whatever other technology you're looking for, right? However you want to do styling, do it that way. However you want to do routing and server-side rendering, do it that way. I think we're looking at something that's more on the end of like Ruby on Rails, where like there's one way we do things and this is how you should do it. And if you don't do it that way, it's going to be harder, right? And no code is like even more opinionated with that. So I think there's a lot of times where you kind of have to say, well, whatever platform you choose, they made some calls up front of this is how we like doing. And generally you need to lean into that. So Toddle, for example, gives you a ton of flexibility on what you can do, but we generally have a fairly strong opinion about how do you do styling, how do you do A, B, and C. So I think that's usually the first one. And we see a lot of people like, oh, I wanted to do it this way. And we basically say, well, you can achieve what you're looking for, but you can't do it that way.
Right. What advice would you give developers who are interested in exploring or transitioning into the world of no-code development?
Well, I think the first thing is it's important to start out with an open mind, especially because I think a lot of, if it's a more experienced developer that's been around for time, I think a lot of them are sitting with the feeling of we've heard this story before. There is nothing original in the idea of no code or visual development. The earliest example I've been able to find is from 1963. So before it became a standard to have monitors attached to computers, someone started to paint and start programming with a light pen. So it really isn't new, right? And we've seen all these examples of Visual Basics was probably one of the most successful ones, but we've also seen Dreamweaver, and we've seen a lot of them. And they never really took off. And I think a lot of people have a general feeling of it's nice and it's cool, but obviously you can't do real programming with it, right? You can't build anything complex. That's the big change that's happening today, that we're beginning to see platforms that actually let you build things that are immensely complex, things that are scalable beyond what most people ever thought was possible with that. So I think that's probably the main thing. Come at it with a little bit of an open mind, because a lot has happened since maybe last time people took a stab at this, right?
Yeah, agreed. I think it's important to understand there is a lot of engineering gone behind developing the no-code platform, which allows you to move faster and not treat it as something which is just for fun and games.
Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to touch on was methodology. So when you're developing software, you usually have the traditional way of developing software is waterfall, and now mostly it's agile. When you're doing no-code development, what methodology do you use?
Well, I think that kind of still is left up to people. I mean, generally, your platform is not going to dictate your team structure, and they're not going to dictate how you want to run your software process. I think the one thing we've seen that's interesting is that it opens up for a new way, at least what we've experienced with Toddle. It opens up for a new level of agility that you didn't have before. So as I said, like traditionally, even if you're working in Agile, what you're doing is you're reducing your iteration time to maybe what you're spitting out in a week. But you're still having a team that's put together, people with different backgrounds, and you still largely have this sort of designer feeding designs to a developer to be implemented, right? And so what we've seen a lot is that when you start bringing iteration time down, and not just iteration time, but also the time it takes to actually go from, I want to start working on a feature till that feature is done. Like the time to deploy in Toddle, for example, is incredibly short as well. So we've had cases where, for example, a user has reported a bug, and I think our current record is 11 seconds from it was reported till there was a fix live. Now, that was a really trivial bug, of course, right? But that's kind of the level. And when those tools become available, when you start changing what the normal is, all of a sudden your team, at least in our case, also start working a little bit different, right? So I've worked in companies that had very large, complex setup for how you release a feature, where you have staging environments and you have even pre-staging environments and staging environments. And then you have level 1, 2, and 3 environments before things got released, right? And anything from that to a way more sort of continuous deployment model. And with Toddle, we've sort of been able to take that even further, where we are sort of internally very heavily relying on using feature flags. So someone can literally push, like we're pushing to production. I think we're a 5-person team, and we have days where we push to production 20 to 30 times. And we are not always shipping all those features. A lot of times they're feature flags, so we're the only ones that actually get to explore them. But the fact that we can do that, and it's not just engineers that are doing that, but our designer is doing that as well, right? He's modified design and actually get these things out really, really quickly. So I think that started sort of, there's new opportunities of how you can work, which is sort of like agile, but even more agile, if you will.
The other question I've got is something related to my personal experience. Quite early on in my career, I worked as a VB6 developer. And VB6 had a very low barrier of entry. Almost anybody could pick it up and start coding in VB6 and start delivering to the business. And that meant there were a plethora of VB6 developers, and that talent was easily available, which meant that the only way you could differentiate was being very good in the domain. So you became a VB6 developer with, say, FX options knowledge, which allowed you to differentiate yourself in the job market. Is it something similar for a developer who's developing in a no-code platform? And how do they progress in their career?
I don't know if we've entirely seen that trend yet, or at least seen enough of it to conclude that's where things are going. But I think it's a very likely outcome. We've lowered the barrier of entry to development, which means that obviously a lot more people can. And I think one of the interesting things is, as we're saying, all of a sudden, the designers on the Toddle team are not just designing anymore. They're actually developing, but they're just developing a very specific aspect of our application. So they are essentially UI UX developers and not just designers, right? They've embraced that, and without having to fundamentally change that much about their current skill set, they've now adopted a whole new role. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of our developers that come from a traditional coding background are still doing many of the same things they're doing, but a lot of the UI implementation work, they're not doing as much of anymore. And a lot of the traditional, like, there was always a ton of tickets was like, can you please change the text on this button? That kind of stuff, right? Which was never really, it didn't feel like there was a reason to have a senior engineer handle that one, right? So those kind of tasks kind of go away because they're so easy to implement for anyone that it's kind of easier to fix it in the app than it is to create a Jira ticket, right?
Yeah.
So I think roles do change. And I think to some degree, we are seeing more specialization in that way towards focus of design and focus on either logic, or I think we'll also see a lot more full stack developers in this world, because if you understand the logic of how it works one place and the other, there's not that big of a gap, right? Kind of like we saw it with JavaScript, that once people could start working in one language, all of a sudden we saw a lot more full stack developers, right?
What is full stack in a no-code world?
So I think it largely means the same as it does in the traditional sense. So, for example, Toddle, as we build, is only focused on the front end. So it's built to connect to a backend, whether that backend is built in code or whether it's built in another no-code tool that focuses on the backend, right? But I think it largely is the same responsibility of someone that cuts across that network connection between the browser and the backend, that focuses on not just how do we present this information to the user and how do they interact with it, but also how do we store it, how do we update these things. And it'll most likely be anything from database design to implementing a lot of this in the front end as well. So if anything, it might go a little bit further than it did before.
Okay, and I think that's a good segue into our next section, which is a deep dive into Toddle. And the question I've got to start it off would be, why does Toddle not have a database?
Yes. So there's a couple of reasons actually why it doesn't have a database. One of them is that it's practical not to have one. So when I started out looking at Toddle, I was sort of saying, like, how can I actually make this work, right? I wanted to build a tool where at least coding is optional. And it's very clear, like, if coding is optional, then where do you put your source code doesn't make any sense, right? If I'm removing code as a barrier to getting started, you kind of also have to remove your source code GitHub style hosting, right? Because it doesn't really make sense to have that. So I also needed like a version control system built for Toddle. Like going line by line and comparing anything wouldn't make sense when you weren't working with source code, right? And of course, the last part is actually figuring out how to deploy all this and run it is also something we often as engineers end up spending an enormous amount of time on. Even if we're using a service provider, there's still always work setting that up. So it's also very clear for this actually to work, I would also need to have a hosted service. So I was like, I'm building a programming language and an editor to work with that programming language, as well as a version control system and a hosting provider. I don't really need to add more to that stack. I feel like that's already more than enough to try and get working, right? So a purely practical of saying trying to do everything will mean that I'm going to end up doing most of it sort of less than ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the other part is actually probably for the same reason where we never really saw a full stack code framework. We've seen some examples trying, and then, I mean, certainly some of them has been more successful than others, but the model never won out. And I think the fundamental reason for that is that while the front end tends to not be too dependent on the kind of app you're building, like whether you're building a web shop or a social media platform or a enterprise, scheduling software, React tends to be the number one choice of framework for the front end. Or there are other choices, and I mean, this is certainly not a React is necessarily better than any of them, but it is the most popular, right? So we have this one framework that works across all of them. And the other frameworks are not more industry specific, right? They're all super cross-functional in nature. Now, when we go to the backend, people start to pick technology a little bit more specifically based on a use case. In the front end, we tend to largely just go with the front end framework. And you'll pick one or the other, but it's always got to be one of the big three, right? On the backend, I think there's a lot more variation. So sometimes it makes sense to have some Lambdas running some JavaScript. Sometimes you're setting up Go and Docker containers. Sometimes you have, Magenta e-commerce platform. Sometimes you're hooking into a whole different system. So I think when you fundamentally look at front-end technology stacks and back-end technology stack across different companies, you'll see a lot bigger difference on the back-end. It'll be easier to detect what is this company doing by looking at their back-end as opposed to their front-end. I think that's largely why we haven't seen these full-stack frameworks, because the one-size-fits-all doesn't really exist. At least that's my theory to why that never won out.
Right. I think, version control is one thing which is missing from a majority of the no-code platforms available in the market, and Toddle fills that gap. Were there other reasons why you felt the need to build a new no-code platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of came at this from my own slight personal use case. So when I started considering Toddle, I actually spent almost a year trying to convince myself not to do it, because it's obviously a massive undertaking to try and build something like this. But when I started looking at, playing around with the idea of this got to be possible, why does this not exist? Can I figure out how to make this? Obviously, I looked into what actually does that exist. And obviously, the first thing I saw was okay, no code is a very broad spectrum of a lot of different solutions. And we have anything from page builders like Squarespace, right? Which is a no-code tool. but it's very much not one for building SaaS applications. And then as I looked at the ones that were more focused on building applications rather than website, that's a bit of a gray area of overlap, but I think in the more complex end, there was a few things I was always missing. So one of them, as you mentioned, is version control, which is, I don't think any engineer out there would take a job if they said, by the way, we don't use Git. We all work on the same files and we just try not to ruin everything. I think nobody would really want to work in that setup, right? And I mean, if you're one person, it's fine. If you're two people, it's very difficult. And if you're three people, well, you're not all working at the same time. So that just from the world I was coming from of more professional software engineering, of working with anything from startups to enterprise level companies, the idea of not having version control and like a Git style version control was just kind of unheard of, right? Like it wouldn't make any sense. So that was one of them that was really key. The other thing that I had was performance is one of those things that you don't care about until you need it. I think we had this conversation in the React community a lot. Is React fast? Is it fast enough? I think for many things it's fast enough, but it's definitely not fast. And eventually you might run into a scenario where it's not fast enough, and then you need to consider something else, right? And that's kind of the same with a lot of this. In the no-code world, that's just the same problem, but at significantly lower performance, right? And as I mentioned, you can often do a lot of things, but how you do them is differently. So when you're locked into a no-code platform, it basically sets the benchmark, like it sets the bar for how performant an application can be. It's not going to be ever faster than the platform allows you. And fundamentally, you have no ability to influence that. Mm-hmm. So just like with frameworks, it is very important frameworks are fast, because if you need it to be fast, there's nothing you can do if people building the frameworks hasn't built it that way. It's the same thing with no code. And so that was a limitation where I could see, but I can't invest in that as for a larger project if this is the baseline for performance. Mm-hmm. And I think the third bit was basically, I need to be able to know that if I start building a project in this, like obviously in the professional engineering world, if we make a bet on a technology, you got to also know that that holds 6 months down the line or a year, right? And obviously any new technology, there's a certain, like you may not like what you chose. Sometimes you make a choice and you realize it wasn't the best choice. But it should never be in a situation where the platform tells you this is not possible, right? It can't be the platform dictating what kind of features you can build. And that was kind of the case for all of the existing platforms. Like a lot was possible, but there's always a limitation. There was always a point where it says you can get to here, but you can't get further. And from where I'm coming from, those were sort of the basic principles saying we can't ever have any of those, right? We've got to have good version control. We've got to have really good baseline performance. And we've got to have a platform that's flexible enough so no matter what problem you end up having, there has to be a solution.
Right. I'm very curious in understanding how did you solve the performance problem? Because fundamentally a no-code platform allows you to build only within the constraints of the platform. So how did you solve for it?
The interesting thing is that that's actually a plus for performance and not a negative, right? So when you're building a framework or a platform, the more constrained your users are, the easier it is to optimize performance, because the less edge cases you have to deal with. So in Toddle, it kind of works. I mean, fundamentally, Toddle works the same way as a web app built in a framework. It's a very, like, if you're familiar with React, Angular, or Vue, actually any of those, you'll really see the influence and the parallels very clearly when you start working with Toddle. And so we actually have the additional benefit of, because we're building the language, like the underlying language, as well as the editor and the framework and the hosting platform, we can optimize things across all three that would be very difficult to do in a code setup. So actually the fact that there are some constraints in how you can do things in Toddle allows us to optimize performance more than would otherwise be possible. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're faster than every web framework. Like some of the new frameworks out there, like Solid and Quick, are showing really impressive performance. But I do think it means that we can be. I do think there's the possibility to optimize Toddle. So down the line, as we invest more and more time in this, I think there's the possibility to actually baseline be faster than most code frameworks for this very reason.
And how do you balance that performance with the flexibility you're able to provide your users?
So that's a really good question. And I think It's not so much one-to-one that when we give more flexibility, you get less performance. It's more when we give more flexibility, we give people the opportunity to worsen the performance, right? So there's always a certain level of like, is this the responsibility of the platform or is this the responsibility of the developer, right? And of course, we could get really good performance by just saying, well, it's their responsibility. We put it on the final developer, right? And then, if images are not optimized, if you're loading too much code or being inefficient, well, you should not do so much. But I think our approach has sort of been, there has to be a balance. We want to do as much as we can. As we say, flexibility is one of our core principles. We never want to not allow you to do something. We just want to make sure that you're doing it in the smartest way possible. So we don't strike so much a balance there. Like we rarely ever limit your flexibility for performance in terms of what you can do. I think most of what we're doing is sort of prioritizing, right? There are some times where we want to build more powerful features for users, and there's some times where we want to go back and optimize performance. And I mean, we're taking part of this journey of making Toddle an incredibly fast platform, and it's a very fast platform today. Performance today is kind of comparable to a Next React setup, where actually Toddle is slightly better on the update performance. So once your application is loaded, it generally performs better than React, at least for large, complicated apps. But there's still so much more work that we can do and that we're continuously doing on getting that even better and even better.
Right. You talked about the challenges to move from staging to release and also to have continuous deployment, and how all of that is solved in a no-code platform where you can immediately deploy stuff. One of the big gaps that I see in the current existing set of no-code platforms is the lack of a test environment, a staging environment before you go into production or deploy into production. Is that something which has been solved in Toddle, or how does that transition from a dev setup to production happen in Toddle?
So what we've done in Toddle is basically what we so often do, which is look at who do we think currently solve this the best? What is the best solution we think is out there? And then can we basically adopt that? And personally, I think platforms like Vercel and Netlify are the ones that has cracked this best. I, for a long time, haven't been a particularly big fan of joint staging environments where code goes to live and eventually nobody actually knows what they're releasing by the time they get around to release cycle, where the sort of Netlify Vercel model of every branch has its own live environment. And you can go and test that and verify and do everything you want. And it's an exact copy of what production is going to be like, or at least as much a copy as you want. You could choose to run it against a separate server if that's what you want to do. And so we have the same. When you create a branch in Toddle, that branch is live from the second you create it. And every time you change it, those changes are automatically updated. So as you're developing a branch, people looking at that preview environment, as they refresh it, will always see the latest version of that, right? And so I think that's kind of the best of both worlds. And how you then decide to manage your deployment process, again, we give you some freedom here. We strongly believe that pushing often and early is the best approach, and using something like feature flags to make sure that you control what actually gets released to customers, which is something we use quite a lot. That's our preferred way, and that's what we're sort of nudging people towards. But you still have the freedom of doing something a little bit more traditional and saying, I want this branch to live a little bit longer. I want to do a proper, like, full end-to-end test on everything before it releases.
So if I got that correctly, what you're saying is that as an opinionated platform, you do not encourage long-lived staging branches. Rather,
yes,
your focus is to try to get your users to use feature flags in production so that specific features as they're released can be enabled or disabled in production.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the team I have here in Toddle is someone I brought along from the last company I was at. This was the same thing we experienced again and again there, that staging environments tend to end up being a lot more trouble than they're worth. And actually, there's a lot of research. There's an almost endless amount of this pointing to the fact that the ability to deploy quickly and having quick release cycles is the number one thing that predicts quality of software. So we're very big proponents of that. And I think that's also what we wanted to build with Toddle. We wanted people to get into that mindset of push early, deploy often, right? And of course, when you use feature flag, deploying to the main environment or to your production environment doesn't necessarily mean shipping new features to customers or changes to customers. You get to do that control in your live environment. So it doesn't mean that you're shipping things that are untested. It doesn't ship that anything is more risky. It just means you have a lot more of a streamlined approach to software delivery.
Right. I think you also mentioned that most of your team are building Toddle using Toddle. What does that mean?
Well, so what essentially happened is that really early on, which is now a couple of years ago, of building Toddle, I got to this stage where I started to realize that this could actually work. Right? Okay, I might actually be onto something. Because in the early days, I was sort of very skeptical about, is this even a good idea? Do I even know what I'm doing, right? So I ran into a lot of issues, but they were always solvable. So every iteration, it seemed to work better and better. And eventually I kind of got to a point where this seems to work. Like when I go through this logically, this model works. Like this platform works for building something very complicated. But there's a big difference between thinking it works and, theorizing that it works and then actually knowing it works. And so I realized in order to both prove to, first of all, myself, but also to anyone in the future, that you can actually use this to build very, very complex applications. I needed to build a very, very complex application. And since I was a lone person working on this, that didn't make any sense having to work on multiple large complex systems at the same time as a single developer. And at the same time, I always knew that eventually the ultimate test of a platform like this is the same you see for any programming language. Are you going to write the compiler in the language itself? That's why most programming languages do that today. And so I started rebuilding, like I had a version 1 that was built in React, the editor part, right? And then I started rebuilding it in Toddle and eventually got to a point where I could then throw away the React version and keep building in Toddle from there on.
Interesting. Moving on to the next section, which is around scalability and performance considerations. Can you touch on the strategies which are employed to ensure that platforms can handle spikes in traffic and usage without degradation in performance?
Absolutely. So because we made the choice early on to at least initially, and I think we don't have any plan to expand on this, but for now we're a front-end only platform, right?
Right.
And we do have a little bit of code running server-side. We are hosted on Cloudflare, and we are running some code on Cloudflare Workers, specifically for server-side rendering. Well, there's two things we handle server-side. We let you proxy API requests through a Cloudflare worker, and that basically means that you don't ever have to deal with things like CORS issues. We can also handle authentication in a very secure way. So even if you require like an auth token as part of a header, we can actually store that in an HTTP-only cookie and then just add the header on the proxy layer, and thereby making sure that your secure credentials actually never make it to the front end, which sort of eliminates a whole suite of potential cross-site scripting attacks you can do, right? And the other thing is server-side rendering. So you actually get like a server-side rendered version of the application as fast as possible to the user. But that's really the only two things we do on the server right now. And since both of those hosted on Cloudflare Workers, they're very good at handling spikes in traffic. They're very good at handling large scalable things. And it's all serverless, so it does scale really well. So I think scalability in terms of traffic is not a particularly large issue for us. It's kind of almost delivered by the platform. Now, that's a little bit oversimplified. Of course, there are always challenges as you scale, but not in the sense that, for example, if you were providing a server as a service solution, you would have to deal with, right?
Right, got it. And is that a similar approach you take for monitoring and analyzing the performance metrics, such as throughput, response times? Is that also something that you rely on the Cloudflare metrics?
Yeah, so we get a lot of it from Cloudflare metrics. We also use Honeycomb, which is a distributed tracing analytics tool that I can highly recommend. I don't know if you've had any of them on the podcast, but it's a really impressive tool that basically allows you to get very detailed view of almost down to a function running in the backend, if you want, of how long did that take to execute and what exactly took time. So when we're, for example, trying to optimize page load time for Toddle applications, we're looking at things like how long did it take for our worker to figure out what project it needed to load? How long did it take to fetch the actual code, or no code, if you will, the actual data that needed to essentially turn into the rendered output for that application? How long did rendering take? All these things. We can break down by each step, like what is actually the performance. And because we have that in Honeycomb, we can also get like, what is the 95th percentile? What is the average? All these things. So we can do a lot more detailed performance analytics of things like how long did different pages take to render, et cetera, right? Which is a big part of how we are also working to optimize that performance.
Right. Moving on to the next topic, which is around security concerns. What are some of the common security vulnerabilities in a no-code platform that is different from traditional coding?
I don't know if they're necessarily that different. I think there are some benefits and some setbacks, if you will. I think the benefits of a no-code platform is, again, back to this idea is that as you're slightly limiting how people can do things, you're also limiting some of the bad ways that people can do things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things, for example, we're doing with Toddle is this idea of saying, well, you can store your auth credentials with us. And by credentials here, I mean access token. I don't mean like your actual password. We never store that, of course. But let's say you're logging into a service, you can sort of choose to saying, when I'm getting a token back, I want to save that as a session cookie in Toddle. And what we're actually doing is we're storing it as a HTTP only cookie and thereby preventing the front end from being able to read it again. And then whenever you're making an API request to the service that needs it, we're adding it back in on the proxy layer. And so that sort of eliminates a whole session, like a whole suite of potential attacks right there. And again, because we can handle a lot of it at a platform level, there's a lot of things where we can actually make this more secure than you wouldn't code, simply because we are closing a lot of the potential issues, right? We're handling a lot of the potential mistakes you could make as a developer. Now, the downside of that is that as your advertisement platform where everyone can learn to code, it also means everyone doesn't have experience with software security and different attack surfaces. So I think if you're overall looking at no code today, I think on average, I think it's fair to guess that platforms are probably a little bit less secure than most ones written in code. I don't think that's the limitation of no code. I think that is that generally, on average, your no-code developer is less experienced today than most software engineers.
Right. I did a quick lookup, and we have not done a specific session on Honeycomb, but we did do a session which was episode 455, where we had Jamie Radisel on software telemetry, and he had discussed a range of topics or telemetry tools.
I will go and look that up because that is probably worth. It's one of the things I only quite recently started looking into, but every now and then you try one of these services, technologies where you realize you're never ever going back, right? Mm-hmm. And this was definitely one of them, like having that kind of insight into what happens in your system. Once you've tried it, you never want to not have it again.
True. Are there any specific compliance frameworks or certifications that organizations should consider when using no-code platforms?
I don't know if there's anything outside of mainly just your standard service providers, things you should consider. There's a few things that I think they're the same you should always consider when using a service provider. So like if you're a European company, you need to be aware, and actually no matter where your company is, you need to be aware of things like GDPR compliance. Mm-hmm. So again, with Toddle, we don't store any data on your users if you're using our platform. So GDPR is not really an issue in our case. And also, we don't do any tracking on any app you do in Toddle. You can obviously add that in if you want, but we're not doing that out of the box, any sort of tracking of any of the users. So that issue is not there. But if you're using a no-code backend, of course, anything where you store data, these are all things you need to be aware of. And of course, depending on your industry, you might need to require things like HIPAA compliance, all these things.
Yep.
It doesn't add any new concerns that you don't always have if you're using, let's say, an authentication provider or a hosted database. It's the same kind of things you have to go, the same checklist you need to go through and verify that actually it is well within compliance of your requirement.
Right. Moving on to the next topic, which is enterprise adoption. What's the current state of enterprise adoption for no-code platforms?
So we're seeing really good adoption on certain areas. I mentioned earlier that no-code is this vast space of many, many different kind of tools. So when we're looking at internal apps, so for example, I think right now the key ones people are talking a lot about, Retool and JetAdmin being two really popular ones. They're seeing a very positive trend also among enterprise customers. We have one of the earlier platforms like AppGyver, which is a no-code platform that was acquired by SAP. So, I mean, that's obviously very enterprise focused then, right? So we are seeing it. We're seeing it in specific areas and usually around internal apps or sort of secondary apps. which means it's not used for your primary product. And again, Webflow also being very successful, we are seeing a lot of really large companies and high-profile companies building their landing pages in Webflow. One area where we haven't seen much enterprise adoption yet is in the actual SaaS space, which is where Toddle also is, right? The area we're looking for. And I think there's largely two reasons for that. One is that the same reason I listed early on as to why I built Toddle are the things that I felt was lacking for me to be able to commit to an existing no-code tool. I think all those same problems is preventing any enterprise adoption. Like, you can't run an enterprise software team if you don't have proper version control. That's not really going to work, right? And at the same time, often when you get to larger companies and it's looking at their products, now the larger software teams start to talk about things like performance budgets, etc. And it becomes normal for teams to actually continuously measure performance as you deploy. And I mean, once you're getting at that level, when things like load times, etc., something you take very serious, historically, a lot of the platforms just wasn't able to deliver on that, right? I think Google and Amazon both did studies on the cost of 100 millisecond load time. And so when some platforms are saying actually page load time is somewhere more like 5 to 6 seconds or 3 to 6 seconds, right? For a web shop of Amazon scale, like that would never work. It would simply not be worth it to go a no-code way. And so I think for the newer tools like Toddle, we simply haven't been around long enough to get to that level. We are looking at really good adoption from early adopters and startups getting started with Toddle and building things, and smaller software companies starting to notice us and start building projects in Toddle. But for these to get to enterprise level, it's going to take a lot longer.
Right. And what's the level of integration support provided by no-code platforms with existing IT systems and infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think that depends a lot on the platform again. There are many different setups for, if you're looking at the kind of no-code platforms like Toddle for the front end, we sort of decided early on that we would want to start with working with everything and then later on making specific things easier. And what I mean by that is we started out building a really good system for connecting to HTTP and REST APIs, right? So basically, no matter what your API is and where it's hosted and what platform it is, it's really easy to connect to it because everything speaks HTTP. And then later on, we're beginning to look at how can we make this even easier for a select amount of platforms. So actually build easy-to-use integrations on top of this abstraction. But by default, you can connect to anything. So there's nothing you can't integrate with. Just like when you're building your front end in React, you're using Fetch to connect to your backend, right? So it works with everything. You don't have an integration that you need to look at, right? For some of the other tools, I think one of the tools that I discovered fairly early on is a tool called Make. There's actually two really big competing tools in the same category, Zapier and Make. And they're basically like a sort of glue code or glue no code, if you will, for services. And what they basically do is you can sort of set up integrations to call each other and then add a little bit of logic in the way. So you can do like, when I get this Stripe webhook, when this Stripe webhook is called, actually call this workflow that I set up in, let's say, Zapier. And then from that call, let's insert a row into my database or call a hook in MailerLite to send an email to someone. So you can build all these automation workflows really efficiently. And both of these platforms has like thousands of integrations. So depending on where you are, some of them are really, really well integrated and designed for that. And some of them are a lot more flexible and sort of has you do a little bit more yourself, but sort of allow you to still work with pretty much any platform you're looking to.
Agreed. I'll make sure we'll link to those tools in our show notes, but Make is quite an easy one to remember. It's make.com and very flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the tools we also use as part of our stack. So we obviously built the front end in Toddle, and then we're using Cloudflare Workers as sort of a proxy layer for server-side rendering on APIs. But we also have Superbase, which is sort of, I think, generally considered more of a low-code or just a backend as a service platform, as well as Make as sort of being a glue that binds a lot of different services and workflows together.
What's the role of IT departments and governance teams in supporting and overseeing the adoption of no-code platforms in an enterprise?
Oh, that's a good question. IT department's role would probably change a bit, but I suppose it's largely the same trend we've seen with DevOps happening over the last couple of years, as you're managing a lot less of your own software and a lot more get hosted, these roles start to change. And so in that sense, no-code are largely manage a service and manage the platform that takes care of a lot of the management of your infrastructure, so you don't have to do it yourself. So in a lot of ways, it's just kind of a continuation of that same trend. I think governance and compliance, those things doesn't necessarily change too much their roles as they see today. I think you always need to validate your suppliers. And in this case, your no-code platform is another supplier, right? So it's as this becomes part of your service infrastructure, it's part of the network of services that you need to be aware of and understand what data is available there. What are we actually providing them? What are the agreements we have for them?
How do you see the landscape of enterprise adoption of no-code platforms evolving in the future? And what trends or developments do you anticipate emerging?
I think the trend we're on now, the trajectory on right now, where we're seeing certain types of tool being adopted very quickly. I think a lot of the build internal tools is sort of the easiest to adopt because I think it's the one that carries largely the less risk. It's not being exposed to your customers, and it's not also usually not a critical part of a data flow, etc. Right? But we're also beginning to see these tools like Zapier and making their way to enterprise and actually being adopted by really large customers that are running very large workflows through these no-code systems. And I think we're generally seeing, which often happens in enterprise, it tends to not be the quickest early adopters, but we're seeing sort of a continuing move forward of adopting more and more of these types of software, because I think for most of them, they see the values there, right? The easier it is to automate something, the easier it is to set up and build, essentially the easier it is to manage for a large enterprise as well. So we're seeing kind of a steady trend towards more and more adoption of these services, and I think that'll continue. I absolutely believe that we'll start seeing the first enterprise companies whose entire products are built on a no-code stack. And if not maybe entire, then at least the majority of the stack will be built in a no-code solution.
Interesting times. We've covered a lot of ground over there. And as we wrap up, a couple of questions. Was there anything we missed that you'd like to mention?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I think I obviously want to say that for anyone out there that is interested in trying Toddle, it's completely free to sign up. And you can also deploy your software and share it with anything you build in Toddle without having to go on a paid plan. So I would encourage everyone to go and try that and see how far this world of no-code has actually come, especially if we have some older, more seasoned engineers there that's tried some of the earlier generation visual programming languages out there.
If people want to find out more about what you're up to, where can they go?
Yeah, so definitely check out Toddle.dev. Toddle.dev, our website, and that's where you can also go and sign up. We are also very active on Twitter at Toddle.dev, and I would also recommend checking out our YouTube channel. We got a lot of content on how to start building with Toddle. We especially have a playlist and a course called First Week in Toddle. So if you're just starting out and have no idea how it works, that's a really good place to sort of start learning how to use this tool.
Thank you, Andreas, for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure. This is Brijesh Ammanath for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.